everybody. Give you a few minutes to kind of look over your text if you hadn't already. Our message tonight, our study tonight is taken from 1 Samuel 27 through 1 Samuel 28, verse 2. There's 12 verses in 1 Samuel 27, then we're going to pick up the first two verses in chapter 28 there. Thank you. All right, let's read it through together, then we'll take some observations. And it reads like this: 1 Samuel 27, verse number 1. And David said in his heart, "Now I shall perish someday by the hand of Saul. There is nothing better for me than I should speedily escape to the land of the Philistines. And Saul will despair of me, to seek me any more in any part of Israel, so I shall escape out of his hand." Then David arose and went over with the 600 men who were with him to Achish, the son of Moab, king of Gath. So David dwelt with Achish at Gath, he and his men, each man with his household, and David with his two wives, Ahinoam, the Jezreelitess, and Abigail the Carmelitess, Nabal's widow. And it was told Saul that David had fled to Gath, so he sought him no more. Now David said to Achish, "If I have now found favor in your eyes, let them give me a place in some town in the country, that I may dwell there. For why should your servant dwell in the royal city with you?" So Achish gave him Ziklag that day. Therefore Ziklag had belonged to the kings of Judah to this day. Now the time that David dwelt in the country of the Philistines was 1 year, full year, and 4 months. And David and his men went up and raided the Gershites, and the Girzites, and the Amalekites, for those nations were the inhabitation of the land from of old, as you go to Shur, even as far as the land of Egypt. Whenever David attacked the land, he left neither man nor woman alive, but took away the sheep, the oxen, the donkeys, the camels, the apparel, and returned and came to Achish. Then Achish would say, "Where have you made a raid today?" And David would say, against the southern area of Judah, or against the southern area of the Jeremites, or against the southern area of the Kenites. David would save neither man nor woman alive to bring news to Gath, saying, lest they should inform on us, saying, thus David did. And thus was his behavior all the time he dwelt in the country of the Philistines. So Achish believed David, saying, he has made his people Israel utterly abhor him. Therefore he will be my servant forever. Chapter 28, verse 1. Now it happened in those days that the Philistines gathered their armies together for war to fight with Israel. And Achish said to David, you assuredly know that you will go out with me to battle, you and your men. So David said to Achish, surely you know what your servant can do. And Achish said to David, therefore I will make you one of my chief guardians forever. Any observations, anything that you take note of? Yes, Al.
Down there where he said he slaughtered the men and the women, what happened to the children?
That's a good question. That's a good question.
I didn't read ahead of it. I knew this before. No, what did he do with them?
Exactly.
Exactly. For humanity's sake, I'm sure they didn't kill them, even though they were probably part of the enemies of Israel at that time too. They would grow up to be.
Right. I mean, these nations survived. You know, many of them survived. So they'd have to have some. It wasn't a complete annihilation.
No,
It was, and the motive seemed to be to kill the people that were old enough to rat out David. Basically, is basically the seems to be the motive. Yeah, seems to be the motive there. Any other observations? Yes, Bruce.
It doesn't seem to be like anywhere in this is David within the will of God. I can't imagine that he's within the will of God being in the land of the Philistines.
Exactly.
I can't imagine that he's in the will of God being a ally of Achish. I can't imagine he's within the will of God living in Gath. Mr. Johnson just said that he didn't believe that the children were killed, but I think quite probably they were, because they would be able to give testimony against it.
It's within the realm of possibility. So, although it wasn't mentioned, they could very well, especially those that were closer to age. You know.
And it's a little uncertain. Did David bring all the animals and the possessions back to the king Achish, or did he bring them back to Gath and enrich himself?
Mm-hmm.
And Achish said, you know, who did you make war against? But I can't believe there's anything in here where David is within the will of God, and it seems like God is allowing this to happen, and maybe even for him to prosper if David is enriching himself with the animals and with all the goods.
Well, there's absolutely, and the road that we'll be taking tonight, it goes right down that line. There is nothing that David does in this year and 4 months of his life that is in any way defensible, is in any way righteous. I mean, there's so much that goes on here. Actually, our study tonight is called Misplaced, because I believe that's exactly what he was. I believe he had veered from God's plan. He had veered from God's will. He had veered from. There's no mention of God at all in that chapter, none whatsoever. Yes, Al.
Later on, when it's time to build the temple, and David's in the position where he possibly could, and God told him he had too much blood on his hands. I wonder if this is the blood he's talking about.
It could very well be. This could be the innocent blood that was taken during that time.
I think Bruce is exactly right. When you go back to the very beginning of the 27th chapter of Samuel, David is making up his mind. He's what we see, he doesn't trust Saul anymore. He's had encounters with him that have both started the same way and ended the same way, and they parted ways. Right. He's concerned, surmising. He's concerned. he's running out of hiding spots. Everybody knows where he's at.
Right.
So the best thing to do is hightail it out of there, and we'll go to the land of the Philistines. You notice Achish gives him everything on the southern border, and the king has taken upon himself, if he just leaves David alone, it appears David will just take care of the southern border just fine, and I don't have to worry about it. And what Bruce said, you can kind of read into this without even trying real hard, he seems to be multiplying things for himself,
Yes.
not taking them back to the Philistine royalty and sharing them with them.
That seems to be the case. That's the way I take that. Although we don't have a distinct state.
And when you go into even breaking it down and studying it more and trying to find, scholars are really divided on what really happened. This kind of ties in, the 28th chapter of Samuel kind of ties in, because, not to ruin the story, but Saul goes out and does kind of the same thing on his own again. So now we're back to the two of them are kind of heading down parallel paths away from each other this time, though, instead of into each other.
That's right. That's right. This is a rather dark period, because what you have is David doing his own thing, and Saul doing his own thing, and neither of them are on track of what God wills. And while David was prospering, there's no sign that this prosperity would bless him, because we'll learn a little later
Right.
that his move to this place would leave him devastated,
Right.
devastated. And it wasn't until he cried out to God that he had lost everything. In a couple of chapters, we'll really see that. But it was a bad move. Yes.
Yeah, I kind of wonder if David thought he was serving God, because he's going after people that had always lived there, and I feel like he was maybe thinking, I'm finishing up where Joshua in the early times didn't finish, wiping them out, taking out Israel's enemies in a very deceitful way.
Yeah.
But
Yes, it is. Yes.
I do think, if we read later, when pretty much tragedy happens, that must have been a wake-up call to him that what he was doing was not good.
I think what David was doing, and even if you give him more of the benefit of the doubt, because he was attacking so many of the enemies of Israel, while telling Achish, I'm attacking Judah, which he wasn't. I think one of the biggest problems that David has is trying to play both sides. He was like Christians that's trying to live for the world and try to live for God at the same time, and that combination just don't work. Yes.
And the statement that he made in the earlier part of the chapter, where he said, if I found, what Bruce kind of touched on again, not mentioning God, he went to the king and found, have I found favor with you? He wasn't worried about by all appearances, it doesn't appear he was worried about finding favor with God or doing God's will at this time.
Right. It's hard to believe. It's
the
hard to
people that
believe.
he was slaughtering were kinsmen to him.
Yeah, it's hard to believe that this is the same man that we saw a chapter earlier. It's truly hard to believe that. Really, David just passed 3 major tests. And after passing those 3 major tests, you would think he's ready for the crown, right? No, David's going to prove that I'm still not ready for the crown. I'm going to do my own thing and follow my own way. Yes, Al?
I often wondered if those tests didn't take a toll on it mentally.
They could very well. And something I've said before that we need to keep in mind is that defeat is not the only time than when we're in danger. We're in danger right after victories in our life. Because if we're not careful, we'll be more vulnerable there than before. Yes, sir.
So saying all that, as I was studying this last week, and I take the liberties to read ahead, this applies to us personally. It spoke to me personally in our life, just what you just said. In my devotions yesterday morning, it's like, don't get so high and mighty that everything's going good that don't think that you still don't need me.
That's right. Absolutely.
And right now, I'll testify personally. Things are going good in our household, but after yesterday's morning devotion, you can doggone sure well bet that Satan is brewing up something to attack us one way or another.
That's right.
He's not going to let this go unnoticed. And if I'm not prepared for it, if my wife's not prepared for it, we could make the same mistakes that were being made here right in front of us in history.
That's right. You know, when we think about God, we realize that God has a plan for our lives. I got news for you. So does Satan.
Exactly.
He has a plan for your life that he would, and his plan is for your devastation. His plan is for your loss. His plan is for your complete destruction. Yes, Mr.
Well, and I've brought up some of the same points that, you know, he didn't ask God. And the fact that, you know, just because you're seeing success does not necessarily mean that you're in the will of God.
Sin will bless you for a while.
Yeah.
It will. I mean, that's what it says. There's pleasure for it will bless you. Well, I can point you some very rich people that there's no righteousness in their life whatsoever. So that's an odd gauge for us to see. Don't measure your blessedness by your bank account. You know, that's
And we will see that even in the midst of it, God will still orchestrate the background. Even when we choose the wrong way, God can still orchestrate the background. But beware, because we may have to suffer something that we would not have suffered because of the choice we made.
God's grace will ultimately swoop in and deliver David from the worst choice that he had ever made, and that was pulling the sword on his own people. David had made that choice. He had. By the end of this thing, David had made the choice to join Achish in the fighting of his own people. I believe if David would have went to the battlefield, David's end would be the same as Saul's. I believe David would have died on that battlefield. I really do. How much grace God has for us, right? That even when we make the biggest, most stupid, that he'll give us an opportunity and a chance to fix it. And then he comes back and sees what sin pays him back with, and it really challenges him. Yes, Hannah.
I thought it was kind of interesting how at the beginning of Samuel 27, David was pretty sure that he would die by the hand of Saul, even though Saul had stopped chasing him. I thought that was like
What's
really
the problem with that thought, Hannah?
every single time he's come against Saul, he's more or less had the victory and the upper hand.
He's had the victory. Everybody that he comes against tells him the same thing. You will be king. Everybody. Samuel, the prophet of God that prophesied, and his prophecies were dead on, crowned him and anointed him. Jonathan, the son of Saul, said you're going to be king. Saul himself has said it already in 2 occasions. You're going to be king. The women sung it in the streets. You're going to be king. God had promised him again and again and again that he was going to be king. But David makes a statement that is completely contrary to what God has told him. Completely.
How many times do we get impatient?
Oh, absolutely.
You know, we get impatient with God, and we're like, it's just been too long, you know, it's been 3 years, it's been 4 years, and I'm still running from Saul. I don't remember how many, I can't remember the time period, but yeah, and just get impatient.
Well, our faith has to be maintained. The faith you had yesterday is not going to be enough for today. Yes.
Kind of similar note. I wrote in my notes that, you know, David's saying that he's basically trusting Saul more to go after him again and lie, you know, more than trusting God to protect him.
That's it.
And I guess it seems weird because the last time he met Saul, God really gave him the victory. But I guess
last 2 times that
it almost seems like it shook him up or something, because he's like, oh, Saul told me before he wouldn't come after me, and here he is again, and he just told me the same thing, so therefore he's going to come back again. You know, but
when we give ear to the enemy, he can mess us up. No matter how good God's blessed us, how far we've come, no matter what, we can be right on the end of a victory. And God's put the whole camp to sleep so that you can sneak in there and make your point, David. David comes out of that and still allows his heart to be transformed, changed. Yes, ma'am.
Another thing that I thought was kind of interesting, like when David became Achish's servant, it didn't take long for him to become just a servant to becoming Achish's chief guardian.
Absolutely.
Mhm.
David was famous throughout all the land. He was famous among the Philistines. I believe David become a trophy of Achish's. You know, I've got the warrior of warriors serving me. You know, and so yeah, it didn't take him to take. Plus, I believe David come across in a way that was so very trustworthy. So very, I mean, while he's lying, he's convincing Achish that he's telling the truth. Yes, sir.
Well, when he killed Goliath, the Philistines were so assured that Goliath was going to deliver the Philistines into their hands. And I think it was a major shock when he killed Goliath and they chased him out of the land and killed a bunch of them.
That story had to still be ringing in the ears
Yeah,
of
it had to be.
every
And
Philistine.
the effects of it
That's
is
right.
what really got to them, because they never expected that to happen.
No.
Especially Goliath with all the armor he had, and the kid goes out with a slingshot and kills
Yeah.
him.
And in their thinking, in their military thinking, they sent out the best they had.
Yeah, they did.
And they thought that David represented the best they had. And when a boy comes out and kills the best you have, which towers above them like a tree, then that's one reason they turn and run, because they're like, if he can do it, what can all these grown men do?
Yeah. And they did go after him and get a bunch of them.
That's right. That's right. That's right. So one thing is for sure, David was where he didn't belong. David was in the wrong place. David was misplaced. By his own choices, by his own disobedience to God, by his own doubt, his own fears, by his own scheming and plan, he had found himself misplaced by God. Now let's look at his life. Let's look at some of the evidences there, if you will, of what it means, signs that you know that you're in the wrong place. I'm talking spiritual signs, I'm talking physical signs, emotional signs, that you're in the wrong place and that you need to move back in line with what God has for your life. What are some of the evidences that you would say that we see here in David's life, that he is in the wrong place?
They don't use the word bow, but he was bowing to another king.
That's right, that's
He
right.
was lifting up Achish. I mean, he groveled to him almost. Who am I? I don't even belong in your palace. Give me a not so good place, because if you look up in that Zilgag, that's not the best land.
Yes, and it's and it'll prove not to be. So let's say he submitted to the wrong king. And that is a sure sign in our life, isn't it? When we listen to the wrong king, when we listen to the wrong things, even if it's our culture in our life, we're moving into the wrong place in our life. What's some other signs that you're in the wrong place? Well, you're also in the wrong
You
company.
don't recognize it.
You're in the wrong company. He was among the Philistines, the very worst of the enemies of God. He was in the wrong company. Although he took 600 men with him with their families, he was still among the wrong. Now, that's not to say that we're not going to rub shoulders with sinners. But that's saying if you're hanging out with sinners 9 times out of the 10 times, you're in the wrong place. According to Psalms 1, that says we shouldn't sit in that arena. Yes?
I think when we compromise, especially our beliefs and morals, to
That's right.
get by.
Excellent. That is so true. That's exactly what happens when we begin to have to compromise our convictions, when we begin to have to compromise what we believe, then we've allowed ourselves to get into the wrong place. Anything else that you think is the evidence?
Following misplaced directions.
That's right, that's right. You're on the wrong, let's say the wrong path. You're heading in the direction that God hadn't sent you. You're failing to, you know, we need to realize that we have been called not to just be Christians. We've been called to be followers of Jesus Christ. And when we cease to follow him, we're in the wrong place. Yes.
Lying over and over.
That's right. That's right. Let's just say deception, because that was a lie is not necessarily what we tell. A lie is sometimes what we fail to tell. You know, it's this whole system of deception that David had brought up against Achish. You know, yes.
I think along with that, he was kind of lying to himself the whole time, because he was basically saying, I'm safer here amongst my enemies than in God's promised land. You know, it's like,
Yes.
he had to lie to basically everybody involved.
That's right. That's right. And this is the worst kind of lying, is when you're involved in self-deception, because you begin to lie to yourself and try to convince yourself that the path that you're on is the right path. Any other evidence?
You're getting your counsel from the wrong place.
Oh, that's right.
In other words, like, in this case, God wasn't anywhere in the equation as to what am I doing.
That's right. God was, and there's another thing. When God is no longer involved in your life. See, all of these are evidences that we're on the wrong path. Take a mental picture of that. This is spiritual more than anything else. And these are evidences in your life when you're on the wrong path. These are evidences in your life when you're in the wrong place. When you're following that, when you're self-deceived, when and this deception here that Rhonda pointed out is there's also part of that is odd behavior. In other words, we act in ways that are uncharacteristic to God at work in our lives. People don't recognize us as the same person. You can tell that in people that begins to slowly back away from God and everything that God has for their lives. You begin to see all of a sudden they stop acting like they used to act toward others. They stop acting like they used to act toward why? Because their source of life is being detached from them in that sense. Yes.
And with being in a country that they don't know him, or people he's not associated with the day-to-day,
Right.
they don't know that this is wrong behavior on David's part.
That's right.
Because they don't know his...
Because they were bloodthirsty people. And they probably thought, well, this is, because Kish was deceived. He was deceived. He thought for sure David was his man. From that point forward. So let's remember these things. You see, David, just when we think David was ready to be crowned, he does the craziest thing. The first thing he does is he leaves his people. He leaves Israel. He leaves the place that he's been anointed, and he moves to a place that is almost unthinkable, Gath. Has Gath come up before? Yes. Has Achish come up before? David, remember in spiritual setbacks, the study, I think, let's see, it was lesson number 7, spiritual setbacks. David goes into the city, runs to the city in Achish, and when he's not welcome with open arms and everything, he starts acting like a crazy man, spitting all over his beard, remember? And Achish says, what am I to do with this crazy man? Why you brought me a crazy man? He barely got away with his life, and now here was David going back to that. In our spiritual life, if we're not careful, we'll go back to those habits that we left behind. We'll go back to that place where God never intended us to go back to. Paul warns us that we can become a slave to sin again. Paul warns us that if we're not careful, we'll fall into the trap that we fell in before. We'll begin to think that there's certain benefits to our sin. Something concerns me when I hear a Christian talk about their past sinful life as if it was their glory days. It really concerns me. Because you want to say, wait a minute. Because we can glamorize, oh, I was mean, I was bad, oh, I got drunk every night. We can glamorize that when it should detest us, when it should be the farthest thing from our life. David kind of glamorized Gath. David kind of got comfortable with those sinful habits. David got comfortable with not having the responsibilities that his ordained self had now in God. He got comfortable on this new path. Yeah?
But when you live that type of life, you don't really value your responsibilities.
That's right.
Because you're kind of a free spirit, and you feel like you can do whatever you want. And that spirit is still floating around out there. You gotta
It does.
It
It does.
incorporate you again.
And see how-
I know what you're talking about.
Yeah.
I've heard people do it.
Oh,
I
absolutely.
did do some of mine, but before I.
And see how quickly it happens. How quickly we can go down to that slippery slope in our lives. You see, David wasn't the only man of God that found himself in the wrong place. Abraham, it was Egypt, the place of abundance, but he was in the wrong place. Lot looked out and saw the cities of the plain. It was a successful place, but he was in the wrong place. Samson played around in Gaza. It was the fun place, but it was the wrong place. Elijah was in Mount Oreb, hiding away, licking his wounds. It was a secluded place, but it was the wrong place. Peter was sitting by the fire, waiting to hear news about Jesus, but he was in the wrong place. We can find it, no matter what our spiritual condition or how long we've been serving God, if we're not careful, we can all find ourselves misplaced. We can all find ourselves in that place where we need to get back to where God would have for us to go. And one thing that David would come to learn is the longer you stay there, the more concessions you have to make. The longer you stay there, it doesn't get better. It gets worse. The longer you stay there, the more the claws get deeper and deeper into your situation and circumstance. So let's take a look. Let's take a look tonight at what David teaches us about being misplaced. First of all, we will look at looking to a place that we don't belong. Before we ever get to this place, it gets to us. Before we ever get to that place physically or ever get to that place where we're actually acting it out, there's a process that takes place in us. And if you want to keep yourself from getting to that place, we have to stop it at the looking. We have to stop it at the thinking. We have to stop it at the temptation of this place. We see the thought process behind it in verse number 1. Notice what he said. And David said in his heart. Let me underline that part. He said in his heart. Just because it doesn't come out of your mouth doesn't mean you're in danger of it. If you entertain it in your heart, if you entertain it in your thinking, if you entertain it in your life, it's just as toxic as if you said it yourself. But he said in his heart, now I shall perish someday by the hand of Saul. There is nothing better for me than I should speedily escape to the land of the Philistines. And Saul will despair of me to seek me any more in any part of Israel, so I shall escape out of his hand. You see, David here in the Word of God shows us the deceptive process that takes place in our life. You see, the very first thing that we see is that he forgot God's promises. He began to discredit God's promises. God had anointed him, enabled him, had pulled him out of every situation and circumstance. He had caused the giant Goliath to fall dead at his feet. He saw him overcome Saul again and again. And every time he turned around, he constantly got the confirmation from everybody that come across this path. You are David. You can hear it from every preacher in the United States and still fall to doubt. You can hear it from every prophet. You can hear it from every situation. We must guard our hearts from forgetting God's promises. That was one of the most dangerous things that he could do. You see, and that word perish that he uses there is a very powerful word, because in the Old Testament it is almost always exclusively used for talking about God's judgment. So what was David suggesting? That Saul would be an instrument of God's judgment against David. Blows my mind. And it just goes with the process. Sometimes we begin to believe that, well, I can't do any better. I can't help myself. We begin to rationalize. We begin to push aside any kind of logic in our life. But then it gets really bad when we begin to say, well, this must be God's will. Because then we begin to then we take God's word and use it against him. What a terrible thing to do, isn't it? God made these promises, but maybe he changed his mind. God made these promises, but maybe it's God's will for something else. The very first, one of the most damaging and destructive parts of this entire process is when we forget God's promises in our life. When we allow that doubt to creep into our hearts, when God's told us we're this and we decide that we're going to embrace this, we're going to quickly find ourselves in the wrong place. And then secondly, he painted a darker picture. He made things out worse than they really were. You know anybody like that? Yes, Kate.
What's interesting about that is, if you go back to the end of the 26th chapter, the last interaction between him and Saul actually gives David approval and agrees with everything that David said about what God was doing in his life. And then in my version, and I'm reading here, it says, we don't have any time frame on how that works, but David said, but David thought in his heart. So he had just been somewhat given approval by Saul that everybody is all in agreement at this time on that mountain that he is God's chosen, he's going to be king, and then all of a sudden, whatever Satan used, we don't get that in this text, but whatever Satan is using has turned his heart 180 degrees, that he's concerned about exactly what the version that I'm reading said. It talks about perishing, God's judgment.
Right.
The last interaction he had was God's judgment was going to be for him by Saul's talking that.
That's right. He wasn't assigned to perish, but I kind of wonder if the responsibility began to get to him, and why am I doing this? How is it benefiting me? And when we lose our faith, we lose our positivity. Have you ever met a negative Christian? I think it's a misnomer. I really do. Because, all they talk about is how bad and how negative, and I'm like, faith by its very nature is positive. Yes, we live in a world that is trashy, but God's going to deliver us from this world. Yes, the bad things happen to good people, but God is a great God. And so faith always brings us back to that place. Here's the problem. When you lose your faith, you lose your positivity. And your world becomes quickly darker and darker and darker. And if you've ever had to counsel or deal with somebody that's at this stage, there's nothing that you can say that'll pull them out of that. There's nothing that's in them. Why? Because anything bad that happens is just more proof that the world is against me. More proof that God doesn't love me. More proof, and it just piles on more and more. What we're seeing is the process of the leaving mind. I like to say that because it's the mind that leaves. We've seen it in marriages where somebody leaves. It goes through this process. We see it in jobs. You see it in jobs where there's nothing going right at work, and everything that happens is just this mindset where everything gets darker and darker. We see it in churches. Everything's wrong is going on. I got to leave this church. It's that leaving mind that paints this a darker and darker picture, so that we can feel okay about leaving and doing our own thing. And then thirdly, I want you to notice this. He moved quickly. David knew what he was doing was wrong. David knew that if he stayed around long enough and thought about it long enough, somebody that he had taught about God is going to teach him about God. Somebody's going to talk him out of this. Somebody's going to talk sense into it. Watch out for people that are making quick, rash decisions. Because most of the time what's motivating them is they want to do it and they don't want to give any time to change their mind. They don't want to give any voice more in their life. So see, notice what he said. Notice what he said there. He said, I should speedily escape. He wanted to leave before his conscience could catch up with him. He wanted to leave before somebody could show him how wrong he was. He wanted to leave before he could discuss it. Can I tell you, unless it's absolutely emergency, 9 times out of 10, maybe 99 out of 100 times, you don't need to make a decision right now.
You just pointed, I made a note here, for the first time in several encounters, David did not have any discussion with any of his people that were with him. He made the decision all on his own.
That's right.
And took off, which we saw that one other time when he went to Abimelech to get the sword net. He didn't have any consultation with anybody, just started making decisions on his own.
Those wrong advices. Right. And now the wrong advice is not coming from others, it's coming from himself. And he's not opening it. Watch out when you want to make a decision right now, because 9 times out of 10 it's going to be the wrong decision.
And you can even add to that if you are put in a position that you need to make a decision right now, it's more than likely not from God.
That's right. Because God's going to back up. Like, you know, we don't like waiting on God a lot, but oftentimes it's that waiting on God that causes us to process what we need for the next stage and the next step in our life. When we get in a hurry and we're going to push through and going to do something right now, that's a real problem. And then he rationalized his choice. And he was right. By going to the Philistines, Saul would stop pursuing him. The Bible says so right in our text. He was right. He was rationalizing it. If I do this extreme thing, then I'm going to be safe. I'm going to be all right. And that's one of the final stages of us when we're getting off track with God. We begin to rationalize it. This makes sense. It might make sense in your mind because your mind is deceived. Because your mind is twisted, because your mind is buying the lies of the enemy in your. We cannot afford to hear the lies of the devil in our life again and again. It reminds me of Abraham. Remember Abraham during the famine? He rationalized going to Egypt, where so that he could have his needs met, and he would have to talk his wife into lying about who she was because she was too beautiful a woman in his life. What was he doing? He was rationalizing sin in his life. And the dangerous thing is by the time we get to this point, we need a miracle to get out. Because the next point is living in a place we don't belong. That was David's very next thing. More than just looking at where he didn't belong, considering where he didn't belong, he would take up residence in where he didn't belong. Now, what do we learn from David by him living in this place? One of the most terrible things is this. He took others with him. 600 men that he had taught them to trust God. Now he's taking them to live with the Philistines. Now he's showing them to do what he always said I would not do. Now he's turning their hearts into bloodthirsty marauders. Now he's turning. You see, when we decide to do our own thing and go our own way, don't think it's not influencing those around about us. Don't think it's not going to have an effect on our families. Don't think it's not going to have an effect on our friendships. Don't think it's not going to have a huge effect on our testimony and the way we go. That's why it's so very vital to stay as close to Jesus as we possibly can. Because while you're following him, somebody, whether you know it or not, is following you. And we need to realize that. We need to say, Lord God, help me, Lord Jesus, not to allow that to take place in my life. You see, that's the thing that Lot overlooked. Lot would go into Sodom, and before he could leave Sodom, he would lose his daughter and his son-in-law that would not go with him. On the hillside, he would lose his wife that turned and looked back with a heart toward Sodom more than a heart toward God. And he would later keep 2 daughters, but although he got them out of Sodom, Sodom never got out of them. He devastated others by being in the wrong place. You owe it to your family. You owe it to your friends. You owe it to your relationships. You owe it to them to know what. We cannot be so naive as to believe that our actions will only impact us. And notice what else here he did. He established a homestead. What does that mean? He settled in for the long haul. I truly believe from the words that David said here, that David never intended to leave this place. That David was setting up his little world, his little marauder group of 600 people and their families to rule under Achish. He did it. Just listen to his words here. So David dwelt with Achish. He dwelt with him. He lived with Achish at Gath. He and his men, each man with his household, and David with his 2 wives. Ahimaaz, the Jezreelitess, and Abigail, the Carmelitess, Nabal's widow. And it was told Saul that David had fled to Gath, so he sought him no more. So he begins to he settles in. He seems to love his life. And like I said before, sin works for a season. It'll applaud you for a season. It'll bless you for a season. It'll be joy for a season. Your problems will be gone for a season until it's payday. And then when it's payday and sin wants what it comes back to you. You see, we think of sin as just a violation of the law. But when the Bible talks about sin, it talks about it as a personality. Paul speaks of sin as if it's a toxic enemy that's at work within us. I like what C.S. Lewis said. He said, too many people believe that sin will just go away with time. He said, it doesn't. It just continues its work in our life, destroying and dismantling us and tearing us down. But David wasn't satisfied with that. David was living with Gath, which probably meant he was living in the palace and drinking from the king's table and all that. But then David turned around and this is what he requested. Then David said to Achish, if I have now found favor in your eyes, let them give me a place in some town in the country that I might dwell there. For why should your servant dwell in the royal city with you? He said, I want a home place. I want a place that I can call my own. I want a place that I can settle. You see, that's what happens when we find ourselves in the wrong place. We get comfortable there. We find that place in our heart and our lives where we're like, well, this is where I should be. This is what I should be doing. When God said, no, that shouldn't be the case at all. Can I tell you, as a child of God, don't get comfortable here. You don't belong here. And I'm not talking about Freeport. I'm talking about this world. It's not your home. It's not where you belong. And we need to understand that. Paul warns us of that very same thing in 2 Timothy 2 and 4. No one engaged in warfare, that's you and I, entangles himself with the affairs of this life, that he may please him who enlisted him as a soldier. He said, if you're not careful, you get so entangled in the affairs of this life, so entangled in making a living, so entangled in paying the bills, so entangled in just living life, that we will forget while we're here, and we'll stop being in pursuit of God, and soon enough we'll find ourselves in the wrong place. We need to always be adjusting our priorities. And then David created a compromising lifestyle. Who was it that said compromise? Was it James? Yes. He created a compromising lifestyle. David tried to play both sides. David tried to please Achish and Israel. He tried to do things behind Achish's back to benefit Israel. He tried to play that narrow line that too many people try to play. I'm going to be for God, but I'm going to be for the world. I'm going to do the world's thing and God's thing. You know, Jesus constantly throughout his time drew lines and said, you're either for me or against me. It is time because anything in between is just compromise. And David would learn that the longer he was there, the more rules that would become deeper, the more that was required of him, the more that was taking place in his life. If you move into certain neighborhoods that have rules, you better abide by those rules. And David had found himself among the Philistines, and he found himself under the rule of the wrong king. And so now he was subject to the rules of that wrong king. We need to understand that. But worse than that is that when we compromise, it's like toxic to our soul. We stop being changed and molded by God and start being changed and molded by the world. I like the way that verses 9 and 10 talk about David. I want you to pay very special attention to the words here. Whenever David attacked the land, he left neither man nor woman alive. But he took away the sheep, the oxen, the donkeys, the camels, and the apparel, and returned and came to Achish. God never told him to do this, simply bloodthirsty. It's just simply acting on the flesh. So David began to act like an unjust and an unrighteous man. And listen to what else it said. David would save neither man nor woman alive to bring news to Gath, saying, lest they should inform on us, saying, thus David did. Now, this is one phrase that really struck me. And it read like this. And thus was his behavior all the time he dwelt in the country of the Philistines. In other words, David behaved in a way among the Philistines that he never had before. David was his behavior. This was his behavior. This became his characteristics. This became who he was. If you've ever spent a season away from God's will, and I have, you really know how detestable that person becomes. And I'm talking about myself. Really know how your behavior changes. You really know how your heart is impacted by compromise. You really know how you can find yourself not allowing God full reign and control of your heart and your life. This was a period in David's life. David realized here that he, so much so that the king seems to notice it. Notice what the king said about David. He said, now his people even abhor him. Even the children of Israel that he was raised with, that sung about him, that won battles on his side, now they abhor him. What did they abhor? They abhorred the new David. Because David was changing into a man that God never designed him to make. You see, God was making him a king, but Achish was making him a slave. And that is the way of our enemy. That's the way that the enemies line up. If we walk that fence, we're going to find out the price we have to pay. And that leads us to the very last thing: paying for a place we don't belong. There's a high price to pay when, as a child of God, we find ourselves in a place where we don't belong. The day came when Achish would call David's bluff. The day would come when Achish says it's time to pay up. The day would come when they would line up to fight against Saul and Jonathan and the people of Israel, where he called David and all of his men and said, you're going to the battlefield with us to fight alongside of us against your very own people. Those times in our life when the stakes are raised, when we have to decide, when we have to choose, are you gonna keep that job, or are you gonna obey God? Are you gonna lie, or are you gonna tell the truth? Are you gonna stand for what is right, or are you gonna stand for what is wrong? That when we live a life that is compromised, where we're on the borderline where people don't know really what we are, the enemy will raise the stakes and challenge us in that place. Now notice what it said there. Now it happened, and this is chapter 28, now it happened in those days that the Philistines gathered their armies together for war to fight with Israel. And Achish said to David, you assuredly know that you will go out with me to battle, you and your men. Here's the test. The sad thing is how David responded. You see, there is a time when a choice has to be made. This was David's time where a choice had to be made. And I'm disappointed at his choice. I'm disappointed by how far. You see, some people think that he was just bluffing. I think this was the condition of his compromise. I believe after a year and 4 months, David had deteriorated spiritually to such a level that he was ready to kill his own people.
So as I'm sitting here thinking about this, the message comes to me as I'm listening to you, God, what's going on. This is how quick, God is infinite. He doesn't know time. The writer made point, 16 months.
Yeah.
How much his life changed in 16 months.
Absolutely.
So if you look, take an incident in your life. I'll take an incident in my life. I won't share it, but that's not very long.
It's not.
It
It's
goes
not.
by that quick, and you, all of a sudden, you have walked away from God. You have walked away from what you believe in. In my personal, I'll share, my mom had to come to me and say, look, young man, you better get things straightened out.
Right.
In that short of, to me, that struck me. In that short of time, that's how,
You had a different man.
and yes,
A different man. A man that was willing to risk his life to save, to protect the borders of Israel while he was hiding out. Now he's lining up to kill his own people.
exactly. 16 months ago, he was telling his own people, I can't touch the anointed of the Lord.
Yes.
Now he's ready to pick up spear and sword and go to battle with him.
And touch the nation of the anointed. Yeah, it's a terrible thing. He had a choice to be made. And this compromise would lead, and we're gonna see just how devastating it is in a couple of weeks. I believe it's next week we look at Saul's seance. By the way, one you might not want to miss. Then we're going to look at the rejection, God's grace in the rejection of the Philistine people of David, while he's on the battle, before he goes into battle. And then we're going to see the devastation that happens when he returns home to his camp, and that would break this man. You see, he had a choice. He had a chance to make the right choice. Notice what he said. So David said to Achish, surely you know what your servant can do. And Achish said to David, therefore I will make you one of my chief guardians forever. And that leads us to the very last point. In two places, Achish says the same thing. The enemy has planned for you forever. He's not investing in your destruction for a season. He's investing in our destruction forever. Twice he mentions this word. Achish mentions this word. He said you're gonna. He mentions it. It's in verse 12 of the first chapter, verse 2 of the other chapter. The devil has a plan for your future, and it's for your destruction. The devil wants to strip away everything God has given you. He wants to strip away the promises of God. He wants to strip away those things in your life. We cannot afford to be misplaced, because if we're misplaced, it's one of the most dangerous places to be, because God wants us to understand that his plans are forever. But if we give in to the enemy, we'll find out that he has plans for us forever. It is scary how close David comes to shedding Israeli blood. Scary. And don't think, oh, that bad David. All of us are capable of that. All of us are capable of stooping to that level. All of us are capable of ignoring the Holy Spirit in our life. All of us are capable of turning to our own ways instead of God's way. All of us is capable of that steady and constant decline in our life. And it all rooted in a season with David where he found himself misplaced. God has done so much, sending his only son to die for us, so that we can get on track, so that we can follow his plan, his way, his way of doing things, to bless us, to anoint us, to make us in his image, to transform our lives, to give us a path that truly will be a blessing to our lives. Don't mess it up by allowing yourself to get talked into getting off that trajectory, to doing your own thing in your life and submit your life to Jesus again and again. David gives us this example here. I mean, David comes very close, so very close. And let's learn. You see, there's two types of people you can learn from. One type of people is somebody that gives you a good example. You can learn from those people. The other type of people that you can learn from are people that give you a bad example. And you can learn from them as well, not to go down that path and not to. And David in his disobedience got off track, and by being off track, he found himself misplaced. Well, God bless you. We appreciate you. Thanks for coming out tonight. We're so glad that you chose to study with us tonight.